when I've been playing in different places, whether it's venues, schools, specifically schools, sometimes they've got different jacks. They don't have they've got the 110 jacks, of course, and it might be a 20 amp, it might be a 15 amp. Most of the time it's a 20 amp because it's commercial property. But then they have something that looks like a clothes dryer jack on the wall. And I've seen 30 amp, like camping jacks type things up on, and 50 amp, and then of course the 220. Is that something that as a novice, person, should I be buying adapters to utilize some of those, or what kind of dangers could I get into with that?
Well, there's a lot of questions in that last question alone. As a novice person, no, I don't think so. And simply because the risks outweigh the reward. But you had me at yes right up until that. Is it a good sure, I use distros all the time, and I use, large disconnects all the time.
Define a distro for those who aren't familiar with what that is.
Yeah, I will. And I think maybe I'll just kind of define that kind of in sequence here. But I think the other key thing is that I'm not a novice, right? I'm a licensed electrical contractor. I'm knowledgeable and I'm experienced, but that doesn't mean I think that you have to be that to use these devices either. So let's say that all the people that are watching are people that are striving to learn and they're looking to grow. So their level of novice is going to, fade with time, right?
Sure.
So without addressing the novice part, let's just talk about what these devices are.
Sure.
And then I guess everybody will have to make their own risk assessment as to their level of comfort. I certainly wouldn't recommend anybody go make their own. I think that's the one thing I would just say, look, that's a no-no, So let's talk about what these connectors are first, and then we'll take a little bit of a walk through the different types of electrical services that exist, and then we'll talk about some distros. And I'm going to kind of pick off some of these slides from this existing deck I've got, so let's just dive into that. So, okay, you can see this chart here?
Yep.
So these are NEMA connectors, which is basically an electrical manufacturers association. It's kind of how we classify things, and almost everybody is familiar with a 515. It's the outlet in your wall at home. If you're watching from the U.S., those of you who are not watching from the U.S., sorry, Google it. But here we can see. Back up here. I'm going to turn on my annotations for a second, and here we can see. There's that NEMA 515R, right? So everybody's seen one of those. And that's just the NEMA classification for that particular connector. And you can see how these different connectors are. We talked a little bit about, dryer plugs, like a 1450 or 1430. So those are going to be the most common, typical ones you're going to see. So let's dive into those. Something else you might see in bigger venues and something that's very typical for me, something that just really makes me happy now is, when I see cam feeders, because these are very high amperage, 100 amp, 200 amp, 400 amp, three-phase. This is definitely not novice, definitely not for the faint of heart, but, you can run a small trailer park off these. I mean, you got a lot of power here. So when you have a big concert or a tour rolling through, we're probably going to use a couple of these maybe, The reason I throw this in here, and you might say, what's that got to do with a dryer plug? Well, because they're all cousins,
Sure, yeah. Once
you jump in the rabbit hole, it's just a little bit further down, So... it's we all go on that journey. I didn't come out of the womb with an electrical license, right? I had to learn and I had to earn that, right? So all of our viewers certainly have the same possibility as I do. Anyway, so these are probably some of the most common connectors that you see, right?
Oh yes.
And in the lower right, there's that 1450 we talked about. Actually, I think that's a 1460, excuse me. But anyway, close cousin to that. If we look at our NEMA chart, we can see where those would both line up there. There's a 1450, actually. But anyway, so a quick thing about colors, because colors are very important when we are looking at electrical wiring. We really want to stay only on the left. If it's on the right, we really don't want to play in that playground at all. If we look on the left... excuse me, you can see green, white, and black, the colors we find in our household extension cords and our household wiring. And that's what I mean. It's very comfortable to us. It's very common. Looks like the fonts didn't render quite correctly here, so these should line up. The ground being green on the top, neutral being white, and then our hot phases or our line phases being black, red, and blue. Here's the only thing I'm going to say about the colors on the right, which it looks like PowerPoint actually kind of messed them up a little bit too. But don't, right? If you don't see the colors on the left, it doesn't matter what colors you do see, don't mess with it, right? So, all right. So here's how this works. Here's my ground. Here's my neutral. Here's one of my hot legs, and here's another. And my voltage potential between hot legs is, in this case, 240. And between my neutral and my either of those hot legs is 120. This is on a single-phase circuit. And then likewise should be the same from either of my lines to ground. So I have a good safety ground. What's happening here really when we do that is this. That's how that breaks out. Now, you wouldn't necessarily want to just connect a NEMA 515 like we see drawn here in the top to these, this 50 amp 220 volt connector, because you're going to have way more capacity than you can reasonably use. You could, because 20 amp draw isn't going to trip that breaker, but that's really underutilizing that available power. You would want to have a distro, and you said, what's that? We'll get to that. Here's another example of like a three-phase disconnect, and here we can see that color coding and why it's so important. Because a lot of times we're tying into the box. Again, not a novice move. But this is how three-phase gets converted down. And you can see it's actually really pretty simple when we break it down. Now, we talked about 240 before in the other one. Here we talk about this as being 12208. Why? And you'd say, why?
Why?
I just thought of that. It was pretty clever, huh? I mean, for being sick, I'm trying to be sort of with it, but I'm not. My brain's pretty foggy. So this is why, because electricity travels in phases in the U.S. at 60 times a second. And we can see that at the peak of this wave to the neutral is 120 volts. But from phase to phase, no peaks ever align because it's 360 degrees. They're 120 degrees apart. So the highest point of the peak that matches the highest point of any other peak is 208 volts. So we have 120 volt single phase to neutral, and we have 208 volt three phase to phase. So pretty nifty. So what's a distro? You've been waiting so patiently. These are some examples of some distros. This uses what we call a California plug. You can find that used in a variety of circuits. Typically, we'd find this on like a 240, I think, but we switched our time back to 8 o'clock, and I just got a text from a viewer that said, hey, you guys already started without me. Sorry. So my bad. It wasn't my bad. It's John's bad.
That's
Blame
right.
John.
It's my fault.
We're back to our normal time at 8 o'clock. John knew I was sick, and I couldn't make it till 8:30. So anyway, you can see where basically we would take that bigger plug from the outlet, and we plug it in, and then we have something that's more familiar to us times a lot that we can use, for our power stuff. So another example. Here we can see definitely, 4-conductor, 240, front and back, and you can see you got some, 30 amp plugs in the back locking, and you got some, 20 amp, receptacles on the back. So, and these are rack mount devices, right? They just live in your racks. My amplifier racks have 3-phase versions of these in them. I just plug in the 3-phase cord, powers my whole rack. These things come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Here we can see one that's got a variety of things. It's obviously got feeder in. It's got a pair of neutrals because we might have too much capacity, going through here for a single neutral because it's shared amongst all 3 phases. And we've got all of our SOCAs and that sort of thing. Here's one that an electrician has made for a venue. And you can see this one's a pin and sleeve, 60 amp, but it's got a bunch of different things that are more familiar to us on the bottom. So you could have an electrician make you one. I'll leave that between you and the electrician and the local jurisdiction. That's all I'm going to say about it. And then here's some other, all kinds of shapes and sizes, right? They come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, from rack interfaces to, other things. But a distro is basically something that distributes power. Big plug in, little plugs out.
And of course, most of them also had breakers in them on the front that you could access if something.
Very important. Yeah. Very important. And again, so if I've got just excuse me, follow along here. If I've got a 50 amp 1450 receptacle and I plug a 20 amp device into it, I can go all the way to 50 amps before I'll trip that breaker. And that could be a real big problem for my 20 amp device. Mm-hmm. Again, it's perfectly permissible. But the point is, that's why you put those breakers in there. Because I don't want to have these capacities available to me that are, in excess of what that circuit is rated for. So that's why those breakers are important.
Excellent.
But just like you can plug a 15 amp load into a 20 amp outlet, you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But when we distribute it as outlets to plug in additional loads, then we need those breakers, those overcurrent protection devices in there.
And I think there are some commercial devices that I have seen out there that were not to the high end of what you were showing us, but there are some where it has, I saw one that I think it was at Home Depot that had, it had 15 amp breakers on outlets, and it had either a 30 amp or 50 amp plug on it, and it was meant for kind of a camping situation. So
yeah, there's RV connectors and there's generator connectors. And again, I deliberately avoided those because I think it's kind of, buyer not beware, but you should beware, but buyer be knowledgeable. Right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, if you don't know what you're doing, this isn't a good, you don't learn by doing in the field the first time.
Yeah, this is not an electrical engineering course, and obviously we want the show to be helpful, but in a litigious world, we have to be a little bit careful about what we encourage you to do. So.
Yeah.
John and I are doing this for free, so we don't want to get sued over helping you. So.
Yeah, exactly. So let's jump to our next question here, Ben.